Hello, and welcome back to the reading of White Rage, the unspoken truth of our racial divide. If you have been reading along, then you'll know that we're going to start chapter 4 today. If you are just joining, then I thank you for being with us. It means you have either found me through my YouTube channel or becoming a Patreon subscriber. Either way, thank you for being here with me, and thank you for reading this book with me. It's an intense book. It's a heavy book, but it's an informative book, and it's really important for our continued decolonization work. So let's just go ahead and jump right in. Chapter 4 is starting on page 98, and the name of the chapter is Rolling Back Civil Rights. The Civil Rights Movement was so much more than Rosa Parks refusing to give up her bus seat in Montgomery, Alabama, or Martin Luther King Jr.'s iconic I Have a Dream speech on the National Mall before 250,000 people. The movement was a series of hard-fought, locally organized campaigns, supported at times by national organizations such as King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, shining the Klieg lights of the press on gross inequities in employment, accommodations, and the right to vote. Adopting the strategy of nonviolence, African Americans skillfully used the media to expose the horrors of Jim Crow to the world, from snarling dogs lunging at unarmed demonstrators in Birmingham, to school teachers yanked onto the concrete for trying to register to vote in Selma, to 4 little girls in Birmingham dynamited in church right after a Sunday school lesson on, quote, a love that forgives. This was a battle, as the SCLC noted, to, quote, to redeem the soul of America, end quote. It was obvious that a series of congressionally neutered civil rights acts, one in 1957 and another in 1960, was so ineffectual that the conditions of mass disfranchisement and overt discrimination remained virtually untouched. African Americans and their white allies would therefore put their bodies on the line to shake the American public and the U.S. government out of a fog of moral and legal lethargy. Thus, a triple murder of civil rights workers in Mississippi led eventually to the Civil Rights Act in 1964. And the killings in Selma and the horrific spectacle of Bloody Sunday, where nonviolent protesters were tear-gassed, whipped, and trampled by horse-bound troopers, resulted in the Voting Rights Act, VRA, in 1965. The impact of the civil rights struggle had been slow but significant. Inequality had begun to lessen, incomes had started to rise, job and educational opportunities had expanded, and just as with Reconstruction, the Great Migration, and the Brown decision, this latest round of African American advances set the gears of white opposition in motion. Once again, the United States moved from the threshold of democracy to the betrayal of it. Within 2 decades, having locked up a greater percentage of its black males than did apartheid South Africa. Given the power of this iconic movement, the descent into, quote, the new Jim Crow, end quote, should have been virtually impossible. But by the 1968 presidential election, white opposition had once more coalesced into an effective force, and in the years that followed, its response was carefully implemented. Both the Nixon and Reagan administrations, with the support of the Berger and Rehnquist Supreme Courts, executed 2 significant tasks to crush the promise embedded in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The first was to redefine what the movement was really about, with centuries of oppression and brutality suddenly reduced to the harmless symbolism of a bus seat and a water fountain. Thus, when the colored-only signs went down, inequality had supposedly disappeared. By 1965, Richard Nixon asserted almost every legislative roadblock to equality of opportunity for education, jobs, and voting had been removed. Also magically removed by this interpretation were up to $24 trillion in multi-generational devastation that African Americans had suffered in lost wages, stolen land, educational impoverishment, and housing inequalities. $24 trillion. All of that vanished as if it never happened, or as Patrick Buchanan, advisor to Richard Nixon and presidential candidate himself, would explain decades later. Quote, America has been the best country on earth for Black folks. It was here that 600,000 Black people brought from Africa in slave ships grew into a community of 40 million, were introduced to Christian salvation, and reached the greatest levels of freedom and prosperity Blacks have ever known, end quote. Similarly, chattel slavery, which built the United States inordinate wealth, molted into an institution in which few, if any, whites had ever benefited because their, quote, families never owned slaves, end quote. Once the need for the civil rights movement was minimized and history rewritten, initiatives like President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and affirmative action, which were developed to ameliorate hundreds of years of violent and corrosive repression, were easily characterized as reverse discrimination against hardworking whites and a, quote, government handout that lazy Black people choose to take rather than work. The second key maneuver, which flowed naturally from the first, was to redefine racism itself. Confronted with civil rights headlines depicting unflattering portrayals of KKK rallies and jackbooted sheriffs, white authority transformed those damning images of white supremacy into the sole definition of racism. This simple but wickedly brilliant conceptual and linguistic shift served multiple purposes. First and foremost, it was conscious soothing. The whittling down of racism to sheet-wearing goons allowed a cloud of racial innocence to cover many whites who, although resentful of Black progress and determined to ensure that racial inequality remained untouched, could see and project themselves as the kind of upstanding white citizens who were, quote, positively outraged at the tactics of the Ku Klux Klan, end quote. We've talked before about not touching you racism. I'm not touching you, but I'm being racist and I'm upholding white supremacy. This is a description of it. The focus of the Klan also helped to designate racism as an individual aberration rather than something systemic, institutional, and pervasive. Moreover, isolating racism to only its most virulent and visible form allowed respectable politicians and judges to push for policies that ostentatiously met the standard of Americans' new civil rights norms, while at the same time crafting the implementation of policies to undermine and destabilize these norms, all too often leaving Black communities ravaged. The objective was to contain and neutralize the victories of the civil rights movement by painting a picture of a, quote, colorblind, equal opportunity society whose doors were now wide open. If only African Americans would take initiative and walk on through. Ronald Reagan breezily shared anecdotes about how Lyndon Johnson's Great Society handed over hard-earned taxpayer dollars to a, quote, slum dweller, end quote, to live in posh government-subsidized housing and provided food stamps for one strapping young buck to buy steak, while another used the change he received from purchasing an orange to pay for a bottle of vodka. A strapping young buck. That's how you describe an animal, not a Black man. He ridiculed Medicaid recipients as, quote, a faceless mass waiting for handouts, end quote. The imagery was, by design, galling, and although the stories were far from the truth, they succeeded in tapping into a river of widespread resentment. Propaganda. Second and third generation Polish Americans, Italian Americans, and other white ethnics seethed that whereas their own immigrant fathers and grandfathers had to work their way out of the ghetto, Blacks were getting a government-sponsored free ride to the good life on the backs of honest, hardworking white Americans. Some northern whites began to complain that civil rights apparently only applied to African Americans. One U.S. senator who was asked to remain anonymous confided, I am getting mail from white people saying, wait a minute, we've got some rights too. During his 1968 presidential bid, Alabama Governor George Wallace understood this resentment. He had experienced a startling epiphany just a few years earlier after trying to block the enrollment of an African-American student in the state's flagship university at Tuscaloosa. For that act of defiance, the governor received more than 100,000 congratulatory telegrams, half of which came from north of the Mason-Dixon line. Right then, he had a revelation. They all hate Black people, all of them. They're all afraid, all of them. Great God, that's it. They're all Southern. The whole United States is Southern. But even then, he recognized it couldn't be business as usual. The civil rights movement meant that the days of respectable racism were over. And so in his bid for the presidency, Wallace mastered the use of race-neutral language to explain what was at stake for disgruntled working-class whites, particularly those whose neighborhoods butted right up against Black enclaves. To the thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, who came to his campaign rallies in Detroit, Boston, San Francisco, New York, Chicago, and San Diego, he played on the ever-present fear that blacks were breaking out of crime-filled ghettos and moving into our streets, our schools, our neighborhoods, signaling in unmistakable but still unspoken code that, quote, a nigger's trying to get your job, trying to move into your neighborhood, end quote. For working class whites whose hold on some semblance of the American dream was becoming increasingly tenuous as the economy buckled under pressure from financing both the Great Society and the Vietnam War on a tax cut, this was naturally upsetting. Black gains, it was assumed, could come only at the expense of whites. Not surprisingly, polls showed that as African Americans achieved greater access to their citizenship rights, white discomfort and unease mounted. By 1966, 85% of whites were certain that, quote, the pace of civil rights progress was too fast in 1966. Despite Wallace's premise that, quote, Negroes never had it so good, end quote, by the mid-1960s, African Americans' median family income was only 55% that of whites, while the black unemployment rate was nearly twice as high. By 1965, just 27% of African American adults who had completed 4 years of high school, whereas more than half of whites 25 years and over had achieved that basic threshold of education. African Americans simply refused to accept those disparities as natural, refused to concede that a reality of just a quarter of black adults holding a high school diploma was as good as it was ever going to get, refused to believe that double-digit unemployment rates were just fine for people who actually wanted to work, refused to tolerate a practice where their labor was only worth 55% of that of whites doing the same job. Instead, blacks insisted that inequality was a result of a series of public policies that must be changed. Therefore, they continued to file a series of lawsuits to equalize education. They used the courts to pry open closed labor unions. They elected black political leadership in numbers that hadn't been seen since Reconstruction. Their resolve to dismantle racial inequality led one white woman in Dayton, Ohio to assert, quote, oh, they are so forward. If you give them your finger, they'll take your hand, end quote. The growing consensus was that blacks wanted too much, too fast. White angst rose further with the more overtly militant shift in the civil rights movement. More than a decade of being beaten, jailed, and sometimes killed while using methods of nonviolent protest had begun to wear thin, especially on the youth involved in the demonstrations. Nor had the initial Southern focus of the movement addressed the discrimination that millions of African Americans face in the urban North, Midwest, and West. Thus, nonviolence gave way to an ethos of self-defense best articulated by the Black Panther Party, a group founded in 1966 which openly brandished guns and challenged the police. The goal of integration, so fundamental to the SCLC and the NAACP, was now forced to openly compete with the more sharply articulated demands of Black nationalism and Black power. Soon, in response to police brutality, rioting consumed wide swaths of Newark, Detroit, Los Angeles, and Cleveland, and this served only to intensify the white backlash that had begun with the second wave of the Great Migration during World War II, while also providing whites exasperated by what they perceived as threats to the status quo, with the cover of, quote, reasonableness and moderation. Like Wallace, Richard Nixon tapped into this general resentment. The, quote, Southern strategy, as his campaign handlers called it, was designed to pull into the GOP not only white Democratic voters from below the Mason-Dixon line, but also those aggregated whites who lived in northern working-class neighborhoods, using strategic dog whistle appeals, crime, welfare, neighborhood schools, to trigger Pavlovian anti-Black responses. Nixon succeeded in defining and maligning the Democrats as the party of the African Americans without once having to actually say the words. Nixon succeeded in defining and maligning the Democrats as the party of the African Americans without once having to actually say the words. That would be the, quote, elephant in the room. In fact, as H.R. Haldeman, one of the Republican candidate's most trusted aides, later recalled, Nixon, emphasized that you have to face the fact that the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to. Nixon therefore framed America's issues as, quote, excesses caused by bleeding heart liberalism. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, he asserted, had removed the legal barriers to equality. They had also, he continued, raised unrealistic expectations in the black community. When equality didn't immediately emerge, he explained, lawlessness and rioting soon followed. On the presidential campaign, Nixon's basic mantra was that it was both wrong and dangerous to make promises that cannot be fulfilled or to raise hopes that come to nothing. The point, therefore, was to puncture blacks' expectations. That downward thrust would come through the iron fist of law and order. Crime and blackness soon became synonymous in a carefully constructed way that played to the barely subliminal fears of darkened, frightening images flashing across the television screen. One of Nixon's campaign ads, for example, carefully avoided using pictures of African Americans, while at the same time showing cities burning, grainy images of protesters out in the streets, blood flowing, chaos shaking the very foundation of society, and then silence as the screen faded to black, emblazoned with white lettering. This time vote like your whole world depended on it. Nixon. The point, longtime aide John Ehrlichman explained, was to present a position on crime, education, or public housing in such a way that a voter could avoid admitting to himself that he was attracted by a racist appeal. Nixon, after screening the ad, enthusiastically told his staff that the commercial hits it right on the nose. It's all about law and order and the damn Negro Puerto Rican groups out there. Yet, in the ad, he didn't have to say so explicitly. It was clear who was the threat, just as it was clear whose world depended on Nixon for salvation. In the 1968 election against Vice President Hubert Humphrey, Nixon, in addition to playing on the growing disenchantment with the Vietnam War, won by making the unworthiness of blacks the subtext for his campaign. Following his inauguration, the president targeted two of the civil rights movement's greatest victories, Brown and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This was more than a cynical political ploy to curry favor with a particular constituency. The civil rights movement had raised the ante because now, as in the years of Reconstruction, there appeared to be a strong constitutional basis in the newly invigorated 14th and 15th Amendments for African Americans' claim to citizenship rights. Given the landmines in the new post-civil rights political terrain, outright opposition to the new statutes would have backfired. Thus, Nixon's strategy, one that would play out well into the 21st century, was to weaken the enforcement of civil rights laws. The Voting Rights Act, in particular, was a bête noire of the Republican Party's new Southern wing, empowering African Americans as it did through the ballot box. The VRA, which was able to muster only enough votes for initial passage by carrying the unprecedented provision requiring renewal within 5 years, was set for what its opponents hoped would be its death knell in 1970. As the renewal hearings started, the Republican co-chair of the House Judiciary Committee, William McCullough of Ohio, a fiscal conservative and civil rights advocate, explained that he had hoped the basic foundation of democracy, the vote, would now be accepted and honored. But resistance to the program has been more subtle and more effective than I thought possible, he said. A whole arsenal of racist weapons has been perfected. Instead of outright denial of access to the ballot, the South had begun to use dilution of black electoral strength through rigging precinct boundaries and requiring at-large elections. Think of trying to get rid of mail-in ballots. Think of redlining so that the districts for voting changed. Think about in some census accounting, they don't account for all people. Mississippi, for example, had passed a series of laws that turned the elected position of school superintendent into a political appointee and changed the selection of county supervisor from district-based to at-large elections. And Virginia, which prior to the VRA had assigned election officials to help the illiterate vote, in 1966 mandated that ballots had to be handwritten. The states argued that Section 5 of the VRA, which requires that the U.S. Department of Justice or the District Court in Washington pre-approve changes to election requirements, pertained only to mechanisms that directly affected access to the ballot box, such as the poll tax. In Allen versus the State Board of Elections, 1969, Chief Justice Earl Warren stopped Mississippi and Virginia in their tracks as he laid out that the VRA was, quote, aimed at the subtle as well as obvious state regulations, which have the effect of denying citizens their rights to vote because of their race, end quote. Representative McCullough therefore noted in his support for renewal of the act that it was painfully obvious that 350 years of oppression could not be eradicated in 5 years. 350 years of oppression cannot be eradicated in 5 years. And according to the people that were upholding white supremacy the most, expecting it in 5 years was far too soon. While McCullough saw the need to protect the ballot box, Attorney General John Mitchell announced that the Department of Justice, which he viewed as an institution for law enforcement, not social improvement, opposed the renewal of the Voting Rights Act because it targeted and therefore discriminated against the South. This upside-down framing of the VRA, in the sense that it was somehow not about the law but social engineering, purposely whitewashed the brutal electoral history of Jim Crow, somehow transforming ruthless perpetrators into innocent victims. Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Virginia, and 39 counties in North Carolina were singled out in the Voting Rights Act because they had mocked the 15th Amendment and then contemptuously toyed with electoral discrimination lawsuits brought under the anemic Civil Rights Act of 1957. In addition, many of these states had also sanctioned or even fomented widespread terrorism against voting rights activists. The bullet-riddled corpses of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, unearthed after months spent beneath tons of dirt in Neshoba County, Mississippi, served as a warning that those advocating the right to vote were, as one local woman scoffed, just looking for trouble. The televised fury unleashed on peaceful demonstrators in Selma, Alabama, as they tried to symbolically carry to the state capital of Montgomery the casket of slain voting rights activist Jimmy Lee Jackson, who had been killed by law enforcement, was only larger in scale than the day-to-day brutality that led to less than 1% of blacks in Selma being registered to vote. The horror on the Edmund Pettus Bridge was punctuated shortly thereafter by the bludgeoning death of Reverend James Reeb, who had come to Selma in support of voting rights. The ambush and execution of Herbert Lee, who was helping to register blacks to vote, by a Mississippi legislator, followed soon after by a shotgun blast that blew off Lewis Allen's face, sent a signal that the death sentence awaited those who believed that the 15th Amendment applied to African Americans too. Despite Mitchell's insinuation, the Voting Rights Act was neither capricious nor punitive. It was, as the Department of Justice noted, targeted at those areas of the country where Congress believed the potential for discrimination to be the greatest. In 1966, in South Carolina versus Katzenbach, the Supreme Court, in an 8-1 decision, affirmed the need for federal oversight, ruling that Congress had found that case-by-case litigation based on the 1957 Civil Rights Act was inadequate to combat widespread and persistent discrimination in voting because of the inordinate amount of time and energy required to overcome the obstructionist tactics invariably encountered in these lawsuits. After enduring nearly a century of systematic resistance to the 15th Amendment, Congress might well decide to shift the advantage of time and inertia from the perpetrators of the evil to its victims. I'm going to take a pause there. If you're stopping with me, we're on page 108 and just finished that first full paragraph. This is again, if you've been reading this with me, you're going to understand, or you'll remember or recognize that I say that this book is a clear-cut example as to how history is repeating itself and how how history is a continuation of itself and not just repeating itself. It's not an echo because the noise that is made through racism and white supremacy has not stopped in order to be echoed back. It is a continuous yell into what feels like the void at sometimes. These comments about peaceful protest turning violent due to law enforcement coming after that makes me think of the protests that happened in DC or the DNC with the calling for a ceasefire in Palestine, in the way that protesters were violently drugged downstairs and pepper sprayed and tear gassed, all by showing up peacefully, calling for a ceasefire, calling for the end of the loss of many innocent lives. The symbol, the discussion about the not touching me racism, where they had these ads that were overtly racist. We've talked about this before, where you've got the white hood. You might see a cross burning in somebody's yard. They're using all of the typical slurs. You can tell right away this person is racist. They hate Black people, and they're going to let you know. And because of that overt racism, because it's so in your face, it allows some people to believe that they are immune from being racist, or they are not as racist because they're not like this person. They're one of the good ones. They're still trying to figure it out. But there's nothing to figure out when it comes to human rights and civil rights and how equality looks like. Talking again about how Black people, in the midst of everything, in the midst of being told no about equality, the way that we still show up to do what we can to try and make things better for us on our own, since that's something that we're not being helped with by other people. Talking about how Black people are lazy and are looking for a handout. That is one of the largest forms of gaslighting, to prevent Black people from having any type of self-sufficiency, to remove all of those opportunities, to make sure that you're taking away any type of equality. And then when something pops up to help Black people live, now Black people are looking for a handout and just living off of the handout. That's a level of victim abuse that I will never be able to wrap my head around. The amount of gaslighting that has happened as far back as 1957 and further than that, by telling Black people that we're the problems, by white people believing that if Black people have any rights at all, that white people will suffer. That zero-sum mentality, the zero-sum mentality that comes with the thought of individualism, is what is keeping white supremacy upheld in so many ways. Journal prompts for this week. And I don't have to explain this, but the smiles that I'm showing right now, this is out of frustration. It's frustration with everything, but it's also frustrating, again, to read a book that's talking about what happened centuries ago, and to basically be opening up the newspaper today. But your journal prompts are to think about the ways that you have seen the gaslighting happen against Black people, or towards Black people, and other people of color as well. But the gaslighting that's been happening from the powers that be, the administrations. How have you seen the gaslighting show up? Again, continue those thoughts with the ways that you are seeing history continuing itself and not a repetition. And lastly, I want you to start journaling, and this is going to be an ongoing thing. It's time for the people that are here to start thinking about, what intentional things do you plan on doing to be a part of the decolonization that needs to happen across the entire country, let alone world, but mostly this country as we are here. What do you think, what part are you going to play? What have you seen that has rang a bell that you cannot unring, that you recognize that you can have something to do? Think local elections. Think of not creating or not gatekeeping the education that you receive from people like myself and other people. What are you doing as part of your part of the dismantling of these systems of oppression? Be gentle with yourself. There's so many things going on right now. And again, reading this book while the earth is on fire is such an interesting juxtaposition, because we're in it and we're not in it. And this is me talking a draft out of frustration, so go with me here. And as hard as this book is to read, it's an important read. I will never say that it's not an important read. And there is something that moved me to start this book now, not knowing what was to come. We're on our 12th reading of this book. And every week we're met with something that matches up with what we're reading. That says something. That says something. All right, you have your journal prompts. Be frustrated, be angry, be curious, be questionable, question things, question what you've been taught, question what you know, be curious about things that you don't know, be loud, be frustrated, talk about things, uplift voices where you can. Think about your part. In the meantime, stay hydrated, and I will see you all next week.